Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, BBRF's President and CEO. Today, Dr. Dolores Malaspina will present the gut-brain axis and psychosis. BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants, supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of 190 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the foundation to fund creative and impactful basic, translational, and clinical research relevant to the whole spectrum of mental health. One reason that research funded by BBRF has such great impact is because we do not limit our focus to one illness or condition. Since 1987, the foundation has awarded over $475 million to fund more than 6,800 research grants around the world and across a broad spectrum of illnesses, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Dolores Malaspina. Dr. Malaspina is professor of psychiatry and pharmacology at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine Institute for Translational Medicine. She is a BBRF 2007 Distinguished Investigator Grantee, a 2001 Independent Investigator Grantee, and a 1995 and 1993 Young Investigator Grantee. Our webinar will begin with Dr. Malaspina's presentation, which will then be followed by Q&A. To submit your questions, please use the Questions tab on the control panel. Feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many as the amount of time we have is allotted. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Malaspina. Dolores, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeff. And thanks for inviting me to speak today. I've spent my entire career trying to understand the pathways that lead to serious mental illness as a psychiatrist, epidemiologist, doing genetic studies, and most importantly, doing patient-oriented research. Now, this used to be called spread too thin when I started my career, but thank goodness for the term translational research. Let me see about advancing my slide.
Dr. Malaspina, if you'd be so kind to click on the play button, yes.
Oh, yes, my apologies. We are playing. Schizophrenia-related psychosis is increasing in how commonly we see it, in new onsets of cases, and how disabling it can be. Looking over 20 years, we see this really impressive and frightening increase in the onset and the burden. So how can we understand these worsening statistics is a question I have for you today. Well, some of my first NARSAD funding allowed me to test if de novo mutations might be an important factor for schizophrenia. These are related to paternal age, and despite a lot of persons objecting to the possibility of that, we showed that in fact paternal age is associated with schizophrenia with the new high impact rare variants. So in this way, a gene increasing just the risk for schizophrenia might be introduced. Now you see on the other slide how schizophrenia has really, how both maternal and paternal age have been increasing. With maternal age, we think the effect is more from the accumulated inflammatory conditions a woman might have as she gets older. So what are the models? We've had so many models about schizophrenia and psychiatric disorders. I'm working on the DSM future at this time. But as someone who likes to look at old textbooks and see what people were thinking many years ago, I found this quote from Wells Barker in a textbook published in 1923. And I feel like it was so prescient. You know, after this time, we thought schizophrenia might be a single disease. We know now it's many, but listen to what he says. Most people who go insane are victims of bad heredity or unable to stand the strain of struggle or infections or intoxication. He recognized that the answers would depend on future discoveries and understanding of mechanisms that could not even be visualized at that time. So I'm going to talk to you about a different model, a model of understanding inflammation, why it's becoming so prevalent among us humans, and the gut-brain axis, which is a main organ system for reducing inflammation. And I'll be focusing on schizophrenia and psychosis, but I do believe these same mechanisms will be responsible for many psychiatric disorders. Now, you know a lot about the inflammatory system. Certainly, you know the ouch thing when you have a pathogen or a toxin or an injury. We have just an inborn system. It gets to work right away. You see the redness as the blood vessels swell. Then it gets swollen in the area from the increased permeability, that's leakiness of those blood vessels. And then we attract the white blood cells. And sometimes there can be even a tissue response with fever and more white cells. And every mammal has this identical response to a sudden threat. But there's also an adaptive nervous system. An adaptive nervous system is one that learns. We take advantage of this for vaccines. These are cells that recognize a danger and stay very activated, searching for it, if you will. So that adaptive immune system is what we are interested to understand chronic inflammation. Now, I'll tell you just a few things about the immune system that are really pertinent, and one of them is about cytokines. Cytokines are these very small proteins that allow different types of cells to speak to one another. They regulate immunity and inflammation and always toward homeostasis. So there might be inflammation that's beneficial and inflammation then that's not beneficial. I mean, the cytokines also play a key role in brain development and learning and memory. They're produced in the periphery and also in the brain. You know, increasingly we see these new medicines for inflammatory disorders. If you watch the television or video, you'll certainly see them. And more frequently, the drugs that are being developed combat specific groups of cytokines. So for skin diseases or inflammatory diseases, and for even some cancers, this is the newest area of drug research to recognize when a specific or group of cytokines are overactive and causing an inflammatory condition. So maybe there'll be room for that to occur for serious mental diseases as well. We also have some resident immune cells. They're nicely thought of as the gardeners of the brain. They weed out infection and they prune or eliminate unneeded or unwanted connections between brain cells. Now, that's physiologically very important, but we think in schizophrenia and psychosis, the microglia have been too busy. You can see in the diagram in the lower left corner that normally there's healthy pruning, where a cell or a synapse or connection between neurons might not be useful or important, and microglia in a process can remove that entire synapse. But in psychosis and maybe other diseases, but certainly in psychosis, we know that between childhood and onset, too many of these key synaptic connections are being cut away or pruned. Understanding the immune system gives us another way to appreciate this loss of gray matter that happens in the brain. Now, we also have the vagal nerve, which is so key. You know, we have two main nervous systems. We've got a parasympathetic nervous system and a sympathetic nervous system. These are non-voluntary. They're regulatory, physiological nerves that maintain homeostasis in the body. Now, I mentioned the vagal in particular because it comes out of the gut, and it has reciprocal connections with the brain. Has anyone ever said to you when you were upset, just breathe? And indeed, controlled breathing is a way to activate the vagal nerve. And that is a way to momentarily calm oneself. But having a good vagal nerve is also key to controlling inflammation. So the sympathetic may be for fight and flight and all things for which you might need inflammation, but the vagal nerve is anti-inflammatory. More and more you may have learned that stimulating the vagal nerve is even becoming a treatment for psychiatric and neurological diseases that have not yet been responding to medicine. So we have this vagal nerve binding to cholinergic anti-inflammatory factors. The vagal links all organ systems to the brain. But with respect to the gut, it has two-way communications. And a healthy vagal nervous system does depend on a healthy gut. And we are going to be talking shortly about a healthy gut. Now, what's the evidence that schizophrenia might be inflammatory? We have biomarkers showing that peripheral immune molecules are active, overactive before the illness begins. For neuroimaging, I'll just show you this picture, and it's a brain early, and then the same brain later. And the red areas are areas that are being over pruned compared to healthy individuals. So that's strong evidence, especially since the complement gene was identified on chromosome 6. There's a complement component C4 in this HLA or immune region of our genome, and it has specifically been shown to play a role in over pruning these synapses in the pathway to schizophrenia. And I think we have some evidence finally emerging from treatment trials where agents that treat inflammation, particularly in the early stage of psychiatric diseases, may play a protective role. Also, I'm sure most of you don't realize that antipsychotic medicines themselves are not just blocking dopamine, but they have intrinsic anti-inflammatory and immunomodulatory properties. So all of this evidence is pointing to a role for inflammation in schizophrenia. Now, are we becoming more inflammatory? I think the evidence shows that humans today have a much more reactive inflammatory system than in generations past. One reason might be that we had very, very severe plagues in Europe and elsewhere in the world, beginning in the 1350s, with the last one of significance in just the 1600s in Great Britain. The bubonic plague, or Black Death, or Great Mortality, as it's also called, probably caused the death of 50 to 80% of the European population. So who survived? Those who survived conceivably had a more avid immune response. So that put a pressure on the human allele frequencies that would augment inflammatory responses, including these HLA genes. Now, HLA is standing for the human histocompatibility loci. We all have a specific set of HLA genes, and they are very frequently related to which disorders people may be prone to. But also, we see other stresses. In particular, we know there are more environmental stressors, particularly in low-income areas where we see a gradient to autoimmune diseases from those of the highest social classes to those who have lesser opportunity and disadvantage. We know that a psychosocial stress alone can change gene expression, and that's going to be really key. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. But trauma in early life, even in fetal life, particularly social trauma, leads to the epigenetic change in the expression of inflammatory genes. So over evolution, the pathways that showed a response to trauma and social trauma and adversity, increasing inflammation had been shown to be protective. Now, that may no longer be the case. We have so many exposures now that are inflammatory, that are new and worsening. We have malnutrition, we have shifting infection patterns, we have particulates and pollution, oxidative stress. So we see that there are many factors in our current environment that are making us more inflammatory, and maybe the experiences of our forebears have also made us more inflammatory. Now, what about inflammation and schizophrenia? I'm going to pull you back, I guess, another large amount of decades. And this is a study done in Chicago in 1922 that showed concentrations of schizophrenia in the inner cities. This was followed by research in a half dozen other cities that showed the same effect. Now, at the time, people were not looking at causation by the environment or by the stressors or toxicities of an environment. Instead, in psychiatry, the field learned toward social selection, which would mean that disabled people liked the inner city, or that persons who had mental illness in their family would have a downward drift. That kind of held for a while, but most intriguing to me, having studied this as a resident at Columbia many, many years ago, was the data that came in on COVID deaths. And what you saw again, city by city, was the largest mortality in the densest population areas. Now, the World Health Organization and our Center for Disease Control all had, over this time, identified factors associated with health. And those factors are also associated with psychiatric disease risk. The World Health Organization showed that these independent factors were risk factors for mental illness, and they overlap a great deal with the different pathways that have been studied and associated with schizophrenia. Could there be some unifying final common pathways of the many things that we study? I believe the answer is yes. And we've overlooked the social and environmental drivers of inflammation in the world in understanding the increasing risk for diseases. Now, what other factors are really well known to increase psychiatric, drug abuse, and physical health conditions? One is called the ACEs. The ACEs was developed by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. That stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And they're published online. They include childhood abuse, physical, emotional, or particularly sexual, neglect, and the environment of the household. Mother treated violently, someone incarcerated, relative with mental illness or substance abuse. Now, these 10 items get added up and become an ACE score. And what you can see, looking at the box in the lower right-hand corner, is, boy, are they common, right? So many people, up to almost half, have one or two of these adversities in their childhood. And for every condition looked at, you see a dose response increase in the prevalence of that condition based on ACE scores. I'm showing it to you here for auditory hallucinations. This holds in clinical samples and non-clinical samples. The greater the amount of childhood trauma, the greater the amount of auditory hallucinations. Now, I had studied in Israel the impact of the 6-day war on the risk for schizophrenia, along with a number of my colleagues and mentees at the time studying psychiatric epidemiology. And if you look at the red bars in this graph, they're shown by weeks of pregnancy on the bottom when the 6-day war occurred. And what you see is that early pregnancy was a real risk period for schizophrenia onset later in the lives of individuals. Now, that was moderated by parents that had a high socioeconomic status or education of moms, but still was present. A little later, maybe in the 3rd month, what you start to see is the risk period for affective disorders. This is current data. We're looking at currently is data, which I believe will be in press soon, showing that if you look at the people who were exposed to the Holocaust as children and went to Israel, compared to non-Holocaust exposed persons, also from Europe, what you see is a great increase in cardiometabolic disorders and risks for schizophrenia that go down to the next generation. So we're seeing that trauma in one person's early life can affect their risk for diseases, but can also be transmitted to another generation, giving us a great appreciation for the current circumstances in countries at war and the legacy that this can leave in the population. Now, what happens during pregnancy? It's really important to understand this. When there's pregnancies that are adverse, and that could be psychological stress for the mom, or an infection, or toxic exposure, an array of different adversities will signal to the developing fetus and change many of the genes in terms of being expressed. So we call this fetal programming, and fetal programming from adversity can affect the structure and function of the pancreas and endothelium. That might increase your lifestyle, diet, whether or not you smoke, and stress. When you have adversity, they'll tend to be an earlier birth and often a lower birth weight. You know, that of course we see as a very important thing, but other fields will call that the survival phenotype. The offspring who've been exposed to adversity and survived are in some ways subtly different. And you may think of that as programming that affects the vasculature and the metabolism, endocrine functioning. But those adverse pregnancies also can yield a greater risk for schizophrenia and other psychiatric conditions, for cognitive issues, and for cardiometabolic risk factors. More recently, my group has been looking at the effect of heat waves in pregnancy for reasons some of you might understand. And what we found is that heat in very early pregnancy is associated with later risk of schizophrenia. Now, heat and temperature were the very first toxins associated with birth outcome, the first exposure studied. So it's intriguing as we enter this new phase of time to make sure that air conditioning and cooling is available to all pregnant women during heat waves. I want to just take you a little deeper into adversity, and I certainly don't expect you to follow that flow chart, but this is the definition of the CTRA, the conserved transcriptional response to adversity, even shown in vertebrate fishes. So we have changes in sympathetic nervous system signaling that activates different cells, which change the factors controlling gene expression. That leads to inflammation, and inflammation, as we're discussing, leads to disease pathogenesis. Now, the short-term benefits of having this pro-inflammatory phenotype is you have increased detection of threat. You can detect pain and avoid physical danger, and you're more likely to survive a catastrophic, threatening condition. Of course, the long-term effects of being super sensitive to adversity can be anxiety, pain, depression, and also accelerated aging. We understand aging now as the cumulative impact of inflammation more and more. So these are some pathways. So your question should be, well, is schizophrenia an autoimmune condition? Well, I think to the extent that it shares comorbidities with so many other different autoimmune diseases. For Graves' disease, which is an inflammatory disease of the thyroid, it increases the risk for later psychosis by 1/3. Persons with psoriasis have a greatly increased risk for severe mental illness. Pernicious anemia, in which the ability to absorb certain vitamins is damaged. But look at celiac, for example. Gluten sensitivity, whether or not you have actual celiac genotypes, more than doubles the risk of schizophrenia. And withdrawing gluten from many persons can really lead to healing and resolution. I mean, you know that gluten might be a factor through a careful psychiatric history and doing a trial of gluten withdrawal. What about persons who have lupus or some other vascular inflammation, they have a 5 times higher risk for severe mental illness. That draws our attention to the endothelium, which is the lining of the blood vessels. Other work I did in Israel showed that the sooner a pregnancy is conceived after a couple begin a sexual relationship, a somewhat higher risk of severe mental illness will ensue. And that seemed to be because when that embryo is implanting in mom's womb, mom's not had much exposure to those paternal antigens. So what happens is there's a different type of implantation in the womb, and you can have more blood vessel inflammation we call endothelial changes. In the mom, that can often be manifest as hypertension or preeclampsia. In the child, it can lead to autoimmune diseases and other inflammatory conditions because of this inflammation in the blood vessels. Now, I'm not leaving you all with bad news. There's some good news here. We happen to have a major anti-inflammatory organ, and that's our gut. 75 to 200 trillion different bacteria live in us, whereas our number of cells is half that. Most of us are these microbes. You know, the microbes at birth, which in the best circumstance are from vaginally born infants, those play a role in our earliest immune development, and in our brain development that's ongoing at that time. Late in pregnancy, mom concentrates, meaning her body concentrates, different microbes in the vagina that will be most helpful to her infant's survival and growth. The late pregnancy gut becomes somewhat leaky, so that these healthful substances can transfuse through the placenta. And so it makes us pause about the indications for C-section births. That self or other distinction is happening from the maternal microbes. Now, C-section babies can still acquire lots of healthy microbes and be fine, but there's a tiny bit of a disadvantage there. Putting it all together, we have the brain, and of course that gives rise to symptoms and cognition, but let's look at its connection to the gut. It's a two-way connection through the vagal and the sympathetic. A healthy diet includes mostly fruits and vegetables, or at least 5 a day. And that's very essential because short chain fatty acids are made by fermenting the fiber of the fresh fruit and vegetable. Now, don't turn it into a shake or a smoothie to get your veggies. You really need the fresh fruit and vegetable that have those fibers. We evolved with a diet very, very high in these plant fibers, and they are really at the heart of the healthiest immune system. So we have this very complex gut-brain axis that I had been following for really since, I guess, before 2010, as just so intriguing. I'll tell you something else intriguing about it. I mentioned that the bacteria pass from mother to offspring. Well, that's how this healthy microbiome that's been there for a billion years is transmitted and maintained. It's from the mother to the infant. We have to start giving women healthy foods early in life, right? Because that's what will be a determinant of the healthiest births. So the bacteria, the one-celled organisms, the fungi, all of those that are essential for our gut get transmitted from the mother to the offspring. That's pretty amazing. And as I said, this is controlling brain and physical health. So I want to say something about the healthy gut that I have just said, but it is so key that a diet needs to really have fruit and vegetables. I mean, that is something that's been so ignored. And it's in that way that we have our gut release into the bloodstream these very, very health promoting short chain fatty acids. Now, these short chain fatty acids also maintain gut health. So they're also crucial for those with psychiatric disorders and gut issues, which is so, so common. The other metabolites that get secreted are tryptophan derivatives and some bile acids, and those also promote anti-inflammation through many of the cell receptors in our body. We've been having a second grade extinction, though. I have training as a zoologist and care beyond deeply for the loss of habitat, threatening so many species. But the other species that are threatened are the ones that make up the healthy microbiome. And I've included here some graphs to show what's been happening to autoimmune diseases as microbiome has been lost. And you can see that this is the case for so many other conditions that it's easy to imagine that are increasing risk for schizophrenia and other serious mental illnesses, I must say, which I'm sure have overlapping bases for at least a large portion of cases, are also increasing. So with that interest, I submitted a grant, which on its second round got a perfect score from NIMH, which I'll probably never see again. Well, time is running out, but that was a perfectly scored grant, and it involved recruiting over 100 individuals, research interviews to comprehensively understand their symptoms and their trauma, including a interview we developed called the GBAQ, which is a review of systems for metabolic and gut health. We use scales to assess cognition, and also crucially, we did the complete autonomic nervous system. I've mentioned the vagus and the sympathetic nervous system. Well, most of the times when psychiatrists assess those, they do some resting measures. But we work with really top neurologists, experts in this field, to do an hour-long intensive study of autonomic reflexes. They're not just resting ones. We characterize the gut bacteria, the oral bacteria, the cytokines in the blood, and the people we recruited were persons receiving psychiatric treatment at our clinical center. And we separated those after recruitment into those who had any psychosis, mood disorders with no psychosis, or healthy controls we recruited from the area. Our secondary step was to take the group with psychosis and separate those into schizophrenia and affective psychoses. And the team was just, they still are such a joy. Persons from psychiatry, neurology, radiology, genetics. We've done some nice studies with ophthalmology as well. Cell biology, neuroscience. It really takes quite a team to tease out something that's so complex. Now, it also includes a special imaging of the hippocampus that involves imaging the entire hippocampus, not just one little square in it, and using magnetic resonance imaging that I will not describe today, except to say that from this MRI, you can find out a half dozen different cellular pathologies. So we had those and went forward. Now we published the first half of our sample. I'm delighted to say that very soon, Jacqueline Lee, who's been doing this work for her dissertation in her MD PhD program, will be submitting and publishing data from the full study, which is so compelling. But here, even at our halfway point, we saw that the best determinant of the scores in the PANS, which are here positive, negative, and general psychopathology, could be explained largely by just several different species and their relative concentrations. It included one that was in the oral microbiome and several in the gut microbiome, which we hope will lead to really informed choices of probiotics. Early on, we also discovered that there was a symptom syndrome highly associated with our inflammatory diseases in our sample. It's called the activation or hostility factor. It's separate than psychotic or negative or depressive symptoms. It can be extracted from a full PANS. It includes hostility, impulsivity, excitement, and uncooperative. Each of these items is intriguingly similar to chronic delirium. But what we found is that the association of that PANS factor with BMI, with GERD, with skin conditions, lactose intolerance, and other psychiatric illnesses. There were also strong associations with depressive mood, which is called dysphoria in the PANS, suggesting to us that studies looking at inflammation should be paying special attention to this hostility factor, which we have published. Now, what about taking that hostility factor and looking at it with respect to the brain inflammation from our MRI? What we found is that there were different profiles of cellular pathology predicting this symptom. Now, the greenish blue bars here, those are our healthy controls who had very little of this symptom. But when they did, it had a certain profile that looked at a little bit of diminishment, a little bit of excess of certain things. In particular, though, when you look at the affective or the mood disorder group, what you saw was different changes. And I'm not going to pull you through here because you certainly won't remember all of the metabolites and what they indicate and the directionality. I know because it took me quite a number of years to master this, but just to show you that it may be a common symptom domain, but there are different pathologies accounting for it in these transdiagnostic approaches where you look across diagnostic groups to see if a particular symptom might deserve the same exact treatment, whether or not you had a psychiatric disorder. But I think this is a real key thing. This is work, I think, already submitted, but it was the preliminary data from Eugene Ruby's PhD dissertation, which is nearly complete now. And I just want you to direct your attention to that white bar showing increased choline. Now, choline is a marker for myelin and cell membranes. And when you see it greatly increased, it's an indicator of inflammation of the myelin. I mean, you might think of MS as a dysmyelinating disorder attacking myelin, but The opposite, if you look at the black bars in persons with schizophrenia, it was very, very widespread pathology across all of our cellular domains, suggesting to us, wow, there's possibly more to this dichotomy theory. And before we go too far, lumping all psychoses together, we better pay attention to some different pathologies. So maybe there'll be different cytokines for different disorders, or maybe cytokine panels will indicate what we should be addressing to ameliorate mental illnesses. Another thing that we found, our neurology team was ultimately quite shocked. It's run by Jessica Robinson Papp, professor and vice chair in neurology. And she, along with her mentee, Dr. Mueller, really ran this entire autonomic battery. And then we went forward and we published one piece of it already. This is work that's underway. This is a reflex called the baroreceptor reflex. It determines how much blood will be allocated to a tissue. And it was abnormal in a lot of our psychiatric cases, quite abnormal, as you'll see. But only in persons with psychosis did abnormal baroreceptor sensitivity predict really significant brain metabolite changes. Those are cellular pathologies. And if you look, you see, well, the baroreceptor is a balance of the right amount of vagal parasympathetic and adrenergic sympathetic modulation, controlling blood flow and blood vessels to different parts of the body. It's commonly used in cardiovascular research, but was not used in psychiatric research, certainly not in association with symptoms and cellular pathology of the hippocampus. Two ways you can get in the way of the baroreceptor reflex. One way is too much sympathetic fight or flight drive can cause this pattern of increased energy use and increased sympathetic, and along with that, this dysmyelination that I spoke to you about before. But the other way to get an equally abnormal signal was decreased vagal, poor gut health, poor autonomic health, and that was related instead to a different pattern. And that pattern that we saw associated with increased sympathetic drive, we saw more in the people with psychosis and mood disorders, whereas the loss of vagal was also prominent in those we identified as having schizophrenia. So again, a part of this work was to understand the hippocampal drivers of psychosis, and of course the gut-brain axis. Now let's kind of go into some of the other things that are so key here. Food is medicine is a big deal right now. And we had that Black Pyramid prior dietary guide. We have a new one. It's a little topsy-turvy. It's distinctly new, just issued. It's controversial. It's in the new food pyramid. It emphasizes red meat, full-fat dairy, and states that one of the goals of this diet is to support American farmers, ranchers, and companies growing and producing food. Well, that's cool, but why don't we instead think about supporting our gut microbiome? That will be a different approach. And the approach to best suit the gut microbiome, I would say, is summarized in the Mediterranean diet. I often direct my patients to a Mediterranean diet with at least 5 fruits and vegetables in my version. And we undertook a study to compare the diet in our patients between the standard Western or standard American diet and the Mediterranean diet. And that was undertaken by a remarkable group of junior mentees that I had the pleasure to start working with during COVID when no one could really go anywhere. And we formed a twice weekly little research group to take on the questions of diet. And what we found was that the standard American Western diet, rich in saturated fat, processed carbohydrates, poor in fruits and vegetables, compared to the Mediterranean diet, which we know is associated with the standard American diet is associated with inflammation and insulin resistance. And people have already done some purely dietary interventions in chronic diseases, finding great benefits in multiple sclerosis and Sjogren's syndrome and rheumatoid arthritis. So our question at baseline was, well, are our patients eating poorly? What we found, not surprisingly, is the Psychosis group really had a very poor diet overall. They were much more likely to consume a Western than a standard American, than a Mediterranean diet. But among the people with psychosis who did follow a Mediterranean diet, they had better working memories. And among the mood group who followed the Mediterranean diet, they had a faster processing speed, they had lower general psychopathology scores, less activation and hostility, and even lower depression scores. So this is clear evidence that persons with mental disorders must be having a healthy diet. And among those who have the disease, the healthy diet is predicting better symptoms and better cognition. This first of its kind study, we believe, which we published last year, or this year. No, it wasn't. It was published in 2025, not 2005. This diet really made a very big difference for our patients with psychosis. So where are we now? Well, we've looked at the oral and the gut microbiome. And what it seems like is that the gut microbiome is really very clearly associated with psychosis per se. And when we say the gut microbiome, we're speaking about the microbiota that we have defined in the gut of those patients. The study is led by Jose Clemente, who's my co-PI in this grant, with just brilliant understanding, quantification of the bacterial species themselves, and then the different pathways they accumulate in. And it's the oral microbiome, on the other hand, that best predicted schizophrenia. The oral microbiome reminded me that when I first started my training in the state hospital and New York State Psychiatric Institute, each state hospital in New York still had a dentist because the oral care was so poor and dental visits were not being obtained except while persons were inpatients. No longer the case. But poor oral microbiota are also associated with other serious diseases, not just oral diseases, but systemic conditions, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, respiratory infections, rheumatoid arthritis, chronic kidney disease, cancers, and neurodegenerative disorders. Thinking particularly for our patients of type 2 diabetes, and the metabolic syndromes of cardiovascular disease. So our oral microbiome easily can enter the vasculature and have these key effects. It's also amazingly close to the brain, and will bring me back to olfactory research that I did early in my career with support from BBRF. The neurodegenerative conditions that previously are linked to the oral microbiome include Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, major depression, and now certainly schizophrenia. So poor oral microbiota, that seems to be key here. I put a few takeaway messages. A large portion of serious mental illness has an inflammatory basis. That early stress or infection or life course exposures can trigger immune activation that can last a lifetime. Poor gut health further increases inflammation by diminishing the vagus. And that dietary health might be the key factor for improving serious mental illness. Our data show the gut and oral microbiome are disrupted in schizophrenia and predict cognitives and symptoms and hippocampal inflammation. Certainly a good clinical history should include these exposures, the diet. I think dietary interventions may prevent or moderate severe mental illness. I've seen it in a number of patients who are able to make that change. Then in the future, certain anti-inflammatories will be developed for certain specific patient groups. Just want to send 1 minute thanking my astonishing mother and her mentor. She was from a very large immigrant family, but across the street was Theodore Elsassa. He was a really renowned physician scientist at NYU in the 20s, member of the Harvey Society, and he ran mouse research in his basement that my young mother participated in. She was not allowed to go to medical school, to which she'd been accepted, but did enter the Army and trained as a nurse, overcame so many innumerable adversities. Particularly, I need to thank my muse, which is my sister, Icahn Malaspina, shown here as a dancer. And in the lower picture with myself in the back and some friends. Very dear, very wonderful person. I've written several articles about her. And when she passed away in 2021, during COVID times, I found this essay that she wrote, apparently to me, but never gave it to me, where she described her own self. And I think you'll see the last sentence. She says, the mentally ill are part of the general population. They're not freaks. And mental health professionals have spoken of my life as a circus, said my dear sister, who was among the sickest of individuals I've known. I also want to thank my mentor. My mentor was in college. It was Lynn Margulis. She developed the symbiotic theory of evolution. Who knew I would come back to that research in medicine, proposing that higher organisms were really symbionts with bacteria and unicellular creatures. When she died, E.O. Wilson called her the most successful synthetic thinker of modern biology, but she mentored me, and I am enormously thankful. And finally, just the amazing support I've had and the amazing colleagues I've had can't go unmentioned. Oh, I'm leaving you only a minute for questions, but here I am. Jeff, what do you think?
I think that was just an extraordinary presentation. No surprise, I've known you for a long time. And
Yes.
First of all, full of such important information, done in a user-friendly way for lay people. And above and beyond that, your passion for this comes across throughout, and especially at the end as you were acknowledging some of the important people in your life. So Dolores, we don't have time for questions, but you really answered all the questions that came up. So I am just saying thank you so very, very much for the work that you do, for this great presentation. And we're looking to hear what comes next, because you really are looking at things in so many ways. So thank you very, very much.
You're welcome, Jeff. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Yes. Thank you. I also want to thank everybody who did join us and ask people to consider making a donation to BBRF today. 100% of every dollar donated in our research grants goes to the researchers. We're able to do this because our operating expenses are covered by separate foundation grants. The webinar has been recorded. If you missed any portion or would like to share it with family or friends, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. And join us again on February 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time when Dr. Victor Tang, Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto, will present Advancing Brain-Based Therapeutics to the Forefront of Addiction Care. Thank you, and remember, together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Thank you.
Thank you.